Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you all back here. Many long-standing friends of the center, and as well as our faculty and students, and it's a real pleasure to be here today at the finish line of what has been a terrific project for much of the last 3 years here at the Miller Center, our first-year project. We're now 1 year and 1 week into President Trump's administration. And we started planning this effort in the spring of 2015, shortly after I arrived at the center, but it really came from the Miller Center itself. There was a real question when I came in as the new director here about how we think about the upcoming 3 years with a presidential election looming almost 2 years out from when I had arrived, and how we thought about taking the extraordinary historical archives and assets that we've built here over the years at the Miller Center, our own scholars, and our network of researchers, historians, practitioners, and current administration people at the time and future administration people. That's what the Miller Center is. And after several weeks of planning, we came back with this idea, got the support of our governing council, and started to build both human support, financial support for the effort. It has been a terrific team effort that's brought together all parts of the Miller Center. It built on some terrific things that we had done in the past, not just our scholarly work, but things like the War Power Commission that was done here in about 2009, which was a bipartisan group looking at the president's role in the constitutional system. And that kind of combination of scholarship and former practitioners was something that we wanted to inject into this project. It was easy to predict that any new president was going to face immense challenges. And we knew that because we had looked back at presidential history. Lyndon Johnson once said, you get 1 year. You get 1 year before the Congress stops thinking about you and starts thinking about their own reelection. No matter how big a majority you're elected with, they're going to start thinking about what it means for them in the next year's midterm, both the midterm primaries that will start soon and then the midterm general election. And then on the national security side, we saw from looking back at history that every president faces a crisis in the first year, and the crisis comes at precisely the wrong time, when a new team comes into place. Many of these people may be very experienced, but they don't know one another and they don't know how to work together. And we saw that in particular in the Bush 41 administration, and Vice President Dick Cheney, who then was Secretary of Defense Cheney, told us in his oral history of that administration, Dick Cheney has this wonderful ability to go from being very self-confident to also being very self-critical. He said, on paper, we may have been the best national security team ever. The president, and he might be right, the president of the United States had already had 8 years as vice president, had been the director of the CIA, had been ambassador to the United Nations. Vice President Cheney, Secretary of Defense Cheney had already been a White House chief of staff and a senior member of Congress. Secretary of State James Baker had already been Secretary of the Treasury, had been a White House chief of staff. Colin Powell, the new Joint Chiefs of Staff had already been National Security Advisor. And the list went on and on. Bob Gates was the Deputy National Security Advisor. The National Security Advisor was Brent Scowcroft. As Cheney said, we kept teasing him that he was going to keep having to do the job until he got it right. And he said, we were great on paper until we were presented with a crisis, a failed coup in Panama, and we totally screwed it up. Dick Cheney, was off giving a speech in Gettysburg. I don't know where the hell Baker was. Colin Powell was new in the job, and they hadn't established a process. So what we wanted to do on the project across domestic and foreign issues was think through systemically how a president does the job in the first year. How do they appoint their cabinet? How do they establish those processes that make an administration work? How do they identify their priorities and move forward on those priorities, particularly legislatively, but even the things that a president can do by executive action? How do they manage that very difficult 2 miles between the White House and Capitol Hill and manage those relationships? We heard Jimmy Carter tell us in his oral history that he was elected as an outsider. He didn't need the support of his political party or the lobbying and other groups in Washington. Now that sounds actually very similar to the year that we've been through. And he said, President Carter said, because I didn't have those relationships, they felt like they were on the outside. And it limited his ability to get some of the things done that he wanted to get done. So we wanted to look back across presidential history to assess not just the structure of presidential first years, but what the opportunities and threats for an incoming president were, and to help shape the understanding of the first year for an incoming administration, for the public in general, and for the Washington policy community, as they themselves had to plan for this moment that comes in sometimes every 4 years, and sometimes, as with this president, every 8 years. We wanted to bring together researchers with practitioners, and what we were able to accomplish is pretty extraordinary looking back on it. We had almost 60 essays, which are available still on our first year website, and which today we're releasing in this book, Crucible, which is a collection of what we believe were the best of those essays. This book was edited by Mike Nelson, who's on our panel here today, as well as Stefanie Georgakis Abbott. Mike is a senior fellow with us. Stefanie is the assistant director of presidential studies. And Jeff Chidester, who was the director of policy here at the Miller Center when we started the project, was a real designer of the entire effort and a builder of it as well, and is now the head of admissions and external affairs about a mile and a half down the road at the Batten School. And we're still delighted to have Jeff with us and part of our family. We were able to earn coverage in prominent media outlets, including CNN, Fox, Times, Slate, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post. More than 24 first-year project events across the country. Jeff produced a terrific event at the Reagan Library, including an assembly of previous speechwriters going back to, I think, at least the Reagan administration, not Carter, right? I think we had Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Obama that went from Ken Kachigian, who is probably 40 years out from his job, to a UVA and Miller Center alumni, Kyle O'Connor, who was an Obama speechwriter. He went from listening to Lyndon Johnson's secret Oval Office recordings to writing for Barack Obama. We were able to do events in Washington that connected policymakers and practitioners. Mel Leffler, who co-chaired our volume on national security, who is a Compton professor here at the Miller Center, co-hosted the first event in Washington of the project, or the second event. We launched the project and then did an event on national security in the first year at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And with that, I want to note that we did events, and again, Jeff was a huge part of this, events at the historic homes and learning centers associated with Presidents Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Wilson, Hoover, Kennedy, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. And then finally, we worked directly with the presidential transition teams, both for the Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump campaign. And this work helped connect us to the incoming administration, both in the transition and across the last year. So I want to thank all of them and all of you for being part of this ride with us. And I want to start by quickly introducing the panel, a few of whom I've mentioned already. Mike Nelson first, who's a senior fellow with us and who teaches at Rhodes College. Mike took this work and quickly produced a book with the help of UVA Press, President Trump's first year, which was recently reviewed, I think, in the Washington Post, as probably some other places. Mike wrote for the project, including pulling some of the great excerpts of our oral history program in one of the first memos produced for the project. Mel Leffler, who, as I mentioned, is the Compton professor and the co-editor of the volume on the dangerous first year. Mary Kate Carey, who was a speechwriter in the Bush 41 administration. Mary Kate and I both graduated in roughly the same time at UVA. She went on to work on the Bush campaign. I went on to work on the Dukakis campaign. We know who went farther and higher as a result of that. I was rearranging deck chairs. She was writing a flight plan. Guian McKee, who is in our presidential recordings program, who's a professor here at the Miller Center, who worked on several volumes, including, I think, the third volume of essays, which was Planning the President's First Budget, where He both co-edited the volume and then also wrote an essay on Lyndon Johnson's first year and the passing of Medicare and Medicaid and the lessons of working with Congress in that endeavor. And then finally, Stefanie Georgakis Abbott, who co-edited the volume, who as the Assistant Director of Presidential Studies really is the air traffic controller on all things that happen here at the center. So with that, I want to turn it over to the panel and have you all take it away for the discussion.
So welcome everyone and thank you for coming. I want to start by turning to Mike Nelson and ask him to step up to the podium and deliver his remarks.
What a great pleasure it is to be with a Charlottesville audience and with a Miller Center audience. And what a great privilege it was, and with all thanks to Bill Antholis, to be part of this extraordinary first-year project. And he has told you a lot about it. I want to tell you a little bit about this book, Crucible, which has just been published and which you can actually buy along with this one, Trump's First Year, if you're so inclined. But you know, when you're editing something, you're very, very close to it. And you all know the saying about can't see the forest for the trees. But then months later, the book actually arrived, and I was able to see the forest. And I just sort of opened up the table of contents. And this, I'm saying in part because they just elected new members to the Baseball Hall of Fame. If there were a Presidential Scholars Hall of Fame, the roster of contributors to Crucible would be the inaugural members of the Presidential Scholars Hall of Fame in Cooperstown or Charlottesville or who knows where. It's a wonderful book. And having only written little bits of it, I think I can say that without being immodest. But I'll be immodest when I tell you about the project I took on that came out of my experience. Because what the broader first year project did was kind of immerse those of us who were involved in it in the long history of the American presidency and the long history of the Constitution of which the presidency is a part. We're talking now well over 2 centuries of continuous operation. Donald Trump is the president, but he's number 45. It's a long list of those who came before. And I could go on and on. I won't go on and on, but I do want to just make a couple observations and maybe even read you a couple passages from my book, Trump's First Year, which again was informed by and kind of grew out of the extraordinary first year project of the Miller Center. You know, when Donald Trump ran for president and when he gave his inaugural address, the theme was America is essentially a day or two away from the apocalypse. But what I found looking at the experience of his first year historically was as follows. Donald Trump was fortunate to take office when he did. Unlike Abraham Lincoln, he didn't have to deal with the secession of 7 states during the period between his election and his inauguration. Unlike Richard Nixon, he did not inherit a war in which more than 500,000 American soldiers were bogged down. Unlike Franklin Roosevelt and Barack Obama, he didn't take the oath of office in the midst of a massive financial crisis. Although the world had its share of problems when the Trump presidency began, they were ongoing, not new or urgent. The domestic economy had been growing slowly but steadily for all but 1 quarter of the previous 6 years. The annual rate of inflation was below 2%. The unemployment rate had dipped below 5%. The percentage of Americans who regard themselves as middle or upper class had reached 62%, a greater share than before the 2008 financial crisis. The stock market was already booming. And unlike all his recent Republican predecessors, Donald Trump took office with a Republican Congress. So you look at it that way, Donald Trump was dealt a very good hand. And honestly, you know, I'm somebody who appreciates the significance of the tax cut bill that was enacted last month into law. But when you step back and you think, what have presidents been able to do in the past when they had a Congress controlled by their own party? One major piece of legislation, and for Republicans, especially a tax cut, is sort of like a 6-inch putt, right? So I think that history gives us a way of kind of measuring not the rightness or wrongness, but just kind of the scale of accomplishment. So that's one thing that history, I think, gives us some perspective on. Another is this. You think about the last 70 years or so and the way in which we have chosen our presidents and the talent pool from which we have chosen our presidents. And what you see is a trend at work of which Donald Trump's election was kind of the latest manifestation. So think about this. During the roughly quarter century after World War II, the presidents we elected not only had experience in government, but it was experience at high levels of government in Washington, right? Senators, vice presidents, General Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, every one of them had sort of built their career not just in government, but in Washington. Well, no surprise there, right? Think about what happened before this period began. The federal government was widely credited with licking the Depression and beating the Axis, and Americans had a lot of confidence in the federal government. And then along comes the Vietnam War, and along comes the Watergate crisis. And starting with Jimmy Carter's election in 1976, we as a country still want people with experience in government, but not in Washington, right? That was part of Carter's appeal, as it was Governor Ronald Reagan's, as it was Governor Bill Clinton's, as it was Governor George W. Bush. We're experienced people, but we're not part of that mess in Washington. Well, if you think the next iteration of this trend is somebody who comes along and says, I have no experience in Washington, and I have no experience in government, and that's a reason to vote for me. And that is sort of where we are now, and as people are looking ahead to 2020 and talking about Mark Zuckerberg or Oprah Winfrey, we may have more to look forward to in that way. But again, it's a way of understanding that Trump didn't just drop out of the sky, that there's been a long-term, almost three-quarters of a century-long trend of which he is kind of the most recent manifestation. So where did Donald Trump come from? If not the world of government, he came from the world of business, but a particular kind of business. He was never the head of a publicly traded corporation who had to share power with an independent board of directors and shareholders. He ran essentially a tightly controlled private company, staffed in part by family members, where he was the boss. The point being that he didn't come out of that sector of the business world, the publicly traded corporation, where you have to learn how to share power with other stakeholders, which might be more relevant to becoming president in a constitutional system of government where, guess what, you have to share power with other stakeholders. He also came out of the world of celebrity, but a particular kind of celebrity. He wasn't a Ronald Reagan who made movies and television shows that were inspiring or dramatic, and then, by the way, spent 8 years as governor of California. He came out of the world of reality TV. I don't know if this is one of your guilty pleasures. I won't ask anybody to confess that they watch Survivor or The Apprentice, but understand what drives the success, and he was very successful on The Apprentice for 14 years. What drives the success of those programs is sort of the guilty pleasure, we say, in seeing people fail, in seeing conflict. So what was the catchphrase of The Apprentice? It was not, "You've got the job," right? It was, "You're fired." And so Donald Trump came out of a world of celebrity, but it's a world of celebrity in which conflict and put-downs are kind of the essence of things. Then one other thing about his background is that nowhere along the way, either through experience or interest or study, and by the way, I'm not going to say Donald Trump is stupid. He's not stupid. He's not stupid at all. But there's a difference between stupid and ignorant. I'm ignorant about massive areas of knowledge, like everything under the heading of science. I'm ignorant. Donald Trump happened to take on a job where knowledge of the history of those who have come before, knowledge of the constitutional system in which you are now a leader, might have been helpful. But I'll read you the last thing I'll read you from the book is maybe the scariest, but also, in terms of writing it, the most fun. I hope listening to it the most fun. Nothing in his long business career had required Donald Trump to share power. With his absence of governing experience and lack of knowledge about American history and government, Trump had at best a dim understanding of the sharing of power mandated by the Constitution, both between the state government and the federal government and between the branches within the federal government. Examples of his ignorance, not stupidity, examples of his ignorance abounded. A week before the election, he oddly promised that he would convene a special session of Congress as soon as he was sworn in, even though Congress is always in session when a new president is sworn in. Andrew Jackson, Trump said, quote, was really angry about what he saw happening in regard to the Civil War. Well, Jackson died 16 years before the war. Speaking of Abraham Lincoln to a Republican audience, Trump said, most people don't even know he was a Republican, right? Does anyone know? Well, every Republican who has ever thought of himself or herself as part of the party of Lincoln knows he was a Republican. Frederick Douglass, Trump declared, as if speaking of a living person, Frederick Douglass is an example of somebody who's doing an amazing job. And then maybe a little more distressing and less kind of, at a July 8th meeting with House Republicans, Trump professed his devotion to the Constitution. I want to protect Article 1, Article 2, Article 12. Go down the list. There are 7 articles, not 12, much less a longer list. After mentioning William McKinley to a crowd in Youngstown, Ohio, he wondered, does anybody know who the hell he is? Well, President McKinley's birthplace is 12 miles from where Trump was giving the speech. Weeks after Hurricane Maria racked the Virgin Islands, Trump referred to the President of the Virgin Islands, which, like all American states and territories, actually has a governor. The President of the United States is the President of the Virgin Islands. My favorite, just in terms of, laugh to keep from crying sometimes, but my favorite is when, and of course, let me say this, Trump has been the equivalent of Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. In these ways, each one of those two presidents took a new form of communications media and mastered it, right? FDR, the fireside chats, radio. John F. Kennedy, the press conferences, the debates, television. Donald Trump, social media, right? Social media as a way of communicating his thoughts directly to us, sometimes in interesting ways. As you might expect from a reality television star, he's been great at sort of attaching catchphrases that are negative. Fill in the blank, all of you. So this is like a sing-along. Blank Hillary. Blank Ted. Right? New York Times? Failing. News? Fake. All right, we all remember this stuff. That's pretty amazing. What we don't have are like the equivalent, the 2-word phrases. If I were to say blank healthcare, blank infrastructure, right? In other words, this is somebody who, again, it's the reality TV world, but nonetheless, extremely effective, especially in solidifying the base of supporters he'd already got. Not so much expanding, not at all expanding, but solidifying. But my favorite incident of a Trump is when, the North Korean government for years, they put out these wild statements about the evil Americans and the evil president, and all previous presidents have been like, yes, I'm not going to stoop to that level, right? Until Donald Trump was accused by the North Korean government of being an old lunatic. And his reaction was not to having been branded a lunatic, but he took offense at having been branded as old. I thought, there's something to be learned from that. Well, I'm going to stop right there because I'll guarantee you this is the worst talk you will hear this afternoon, even though it was pretty good because these folks are just the rock stars of the afternoon. But thank you.
Mel Leffler to talk about foreign policy and national security.
I'm always delighted to follow Mike. Long ago, Mike and I were colleagues at Vanderbilt University, and so I learned a lot from him then, and I still love listening to him. So he knows how to say things in a really evocative, luminous, compelling way that makes us see realities. So I also want to thank Bill Antholis and Jeff Chidester for sort of in asking me to be part of this project on the first year. It's been extraordinarily worthwhile for me to do this. So let me tell you a little bit about my role and some of the implications of what we derived from studying the lessons of the first year of 5 previous administrations. So we, a group of very renowned scholars, looked at the first year of the John Kennedy administration, the first year of Reagan, the first year of George H.W. Bush, the first year of Bill Clinton, and the first year of George W. Bush. And interestingly, there was a lot of consensus about why things go wrong during the first year. Let me tell you the things that we came up with very quickly, very succinctly. Things often go wrong the first year because of an absence of coherent strategy, because of poor process and flawed teamwork. Things go wrong often because there's a distracted president who's more interested usually in domestic affairs than in national security or foreign policy. Things go wrong because of poor staffing, delays in staffing key posts in the cabinet. Things go wrong because of tension and acrimony between the executive branch of the government, the chief executive, and Congress. Often things go wrong because the budget process is not integrated with strategic planning and strategic thinking, and there's a gap between them. Now, I don't need to go into any details. Just think about those things, and you know that all of these wonderful qualities pertain to Trump's first year. Nonetheless, as many writers have said during the last 3 or 4 weeks when they've assessed Trump's first year, it is significant that there's been no tragedy. There's been no Bay of Pigs. There's been no 9/11. One really good Republican foreign policy, national security expert said, Trump's first year, in sum, is unnerving, but largely uneventful. And we should be happy, although things may get worse. But I think we should assess Trump's first year. Why is it unnerving? And I would say it's unnerving because the failures dramatically exceed the successes. I think there's one unequivocal success of Trump's first year in terms of foreign policy and national security policy. He's more or less eradicated the territorial base of ISIS in Syria and Iraq. A really noteworthy accomplishment, which was already underway during Obama's last couple of years, but which the military under Trump has succeeded in accomplishing in ways that probably most people did not anticipate. That's about it, I think, in terms of successes. Let me tell you why. This is the way I look at the rest of the Trump first year. Failures. He's neither improved relations with Russia, which he said he wanted to do, nor has he constrained Russian actions in Ukraine or in Syria, nor has he confronted Putin over Russia's electoral intervention in the United States as well as in most European countries. President Trump, for all his rhetoric, has not stopped North Korea's strategic advances. President Trump has made no progress containing the projection of Chinese military strength into the South China Sea, and has done very little to contain the expansion of Chinese influence elsewhere around the globe. Despite a lot of talk about Iran, President Trump has made no progress restraining Iran in the Persian Gulf, nor has he either renegotiated the nuclear deal or improved the nuclear deal or gotten rid of the nuclear deal. President Trump has made no progress in the Middle East negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. President Trump has neither renegotiated nor terminated NAFTA, but he has successfully alienated both Mexico and Canada. President Trump has cast aside America's leadership in terms of climate. President Trump, although this gets very little attention, has failed to redress America's overall trade deficit. In fact, if you look at the statistics, America's trade deficit grew by almost 11.5% during the first 9 months of the Trump administration. While President Trump has been president over the last 12 months, America's standing in the world has plummeted. The confidence, a new poll by Gallup just a few weeks ago, showed that confidence around the world in America has plummeted by 75% in Germany, 70% in France, 54% in Japan. Only 22% of the people around the globe think that the United States today can be relied upon to do the right thing in a crisis. In comparing American leadership, in comparing global leadership roles, people around the world now place the United States significantly behind their confidence in Germany and slightly behind their confidence in China and just a tiny bit above Russia. That's what's happened. But still, none of this constitutes a tragedy. Nonetheless, I agree with those scholars who say we should be worried, indeed very worried. And let me tell you why. It's because Trump's America First agenda is truly a radical departure from the policies that actually made America great after World War II. So what does Trump stand for? What is America First? America First is protectionism. America First is immigration restriction. America First is hire American, buy American. America First is disdain for multilateral institutions and alliances. America First is for building up America's military capabilities and its nuclear arsenal. America First is unilateralism in terms of American foreign policy. America First is to support authoritarian leaders around the world, from Putin in Russia to Erdogan in Turkey, to Sisi in Egypt, to Duterte in the Philippines, etc. That's what America First is. But what are the policies? Let's just remember for a moment the policies that actually made America great for 2 or 3 decades after World War II. What made America first was promoting an open world, promoting free trade, lowering tariffs, championing currency stability, supporting multilateral institutions like the United Nations or the World Bank, championing democracy and self-determination and freedom and human rights, although not always living up to those things, nonetheless always championing those things. What made America great was building alliances with like-minded countries and supporting the principles of collective security. What made America great was supporting the rule of law. What made America great was building up America's military superiority, but also seeking to control the arms race, persistently seeking to control the arms race. And keep in mind, broadly speaking, big generalization, these were the policies that bred peace amongst the great powers for the last 75 years. No great power war. Do you know what an accomplishment that is? That's what made America great. We supported policies that prevented great power war. We supported policies that brought unprecedented, unanticipated prosperity to all of Western Europe and Japan. And more recently, in the 1970s and 80s, to places like South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore. And then since the end of the Cold War, policies that have brought huge prosperity to large swaths of the people of China and India and even Vietnam. These were the policies that brought more people out of poverty in the last 40 years than in any comparable era in world history. Those were the things that made America great. Now, Trump's first year has averted disaster, but we need to worry about America first because it's based on a zero-sum game of world politics, a zero-sum view of the world. It's based on a strategy that actually brought world wars in the first part of the 20th century and repeated depression. That's why the vast majority of foreign policy experts, not Democratic foreign policy experts, but the vast majority of Republican foreign policy experts, oppose the America First agenda because it's not the agenda that made America great. So all of us, all Americans, have good reason to worry about the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. So we're now going to turn our attention to domestic policy making, and Key's going to assess the last year for us.
Good afternoon, everyone. I was commenting to Stefanie as Bill was welcoming everyone today how hard it is to believe that we're here, that this is the final event of our first-year project. And it's been an incredible road for this center, and so trying to distribute to Bill and Tholis, and really to everybody who works here, because this truly has been a team effort and a project that's brought this center together in ways that it never has been before. He's stepped out right now, but in that light, it's really great to have Jeff Chidester back here today for this event. I don't think he's in the back anywhere there. So, in any case, As Stephanie indicated, my role in this panel, such as we've conceived it, is to think a little bit about Trump's first year in the domestic arena, broadly defined. When we think about domestic policy and life in the United States, I guess, over the last year, we're all familiar with the chaos and, of course, with the strong passions that Trump has generated. What really hits me, though, as I try to assess this, is the feeling that Trump and his administration missed an important opportunity this year, that they missed it for specific and troubling reasons, and that they may not get another chance at that opportunity. We know pretty well the general overview of Trump's policy achievements and failures. Legislatively, no significant achievements until the passage of the tax cut in December, the failure to repeal Obamacare or to build the wall or otherwise change immigration policy, or to pass an infrastructure bill. The tax cut was by any definition a big win, but as Mike indicated, this really isn't much of a legislative return when you control the White House and both houses of Congress. Trump, of course, has been active in other areas. Particularly, I would emphasize executive actions, rolling back as much as he can of President Obama's regulatory legacy, from climate change to immigration. Conservatives love much of this, but there's debate over how much a lot of it actually means. Lots of things that were either newly implemented or actually not implemented at all, or actions that Congress had taken. And in any case, it's inherently impermanent. The next president can reverse these executive actions just as easily as Trump took them, reversing Obama's actions. Trump has been notably successful in appointing federal judges, here actually outpacing Obama significantly, and of course Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. Here his role has clearly been quite significant. I will say as an aside on Trump's overall impact, I was struck by a point that the political scientist Daniel Dresner made in a recent column, that most of the recent praise of Trump's record comes from social conservatives, and that conservative policy wonks, people, in other words, who have to maintain a reputation for actually analyzing the effects of policy, have been far more muted or even critical in their assessments. I think this is telling. I haven't evaluated that person by person, but I was really struck by Dresner's argument on that, on who exactly is praising Trump. But back to my main point today, the missed opportunity. What am I talking about? Whatever one thinks of Donald Trump, his election in November of 2016 highlighted a crisis in the United States. The feeling among a substantial segment of the public that conventional politics and governance have failed them, that their leaders no longer acted in their interests, economic, cultural, even regional. Now, we can parse the motivations of Trump voters in many ways, and people have done that pretty much endlessly since the election. For example, there's a strongly held belief on the left, people like Ta-Nehisi Coates is the best example, that nativist and racial motivations drove most Trump voters. I certainly think that's part of it, but I think there's more going on. And in any case, we need to hold in mind that multiple things can be true at once when evaluating a group of voters or even an individual voter in a particular choice in a specific election. In the end, I think that frustration and alienation with politics is the overarching reason that Trump eked out his Electoral College win. So on this basis, my assessment is that a year ago, Trump had an opportunity to address this phenomenon in ways that would have served him well politically and that might actually have helped the country. But he and his administration followed a different course. Ultimately, that is not the fault of the congressional Republicans or the fault of the Democrats. It is on the president. So how do I get to this? From my essay for the first year project, of course. As Bill mentioned, I wrote about Lyndon Johnson's role in the passage of Medicare and Medicaid in 1965, from which I derived 6 general, if perhaps not universal, guidelines for how a new president can advance a legislative agenda. You can find them all in the Crucible volume out in the lobby. I'm very proud of them, and all of the essays. The specifics, though, of Johnson's particular tactics, I think, are less important than the overall point of the essay, which is that the political skill, policy and message discipline, and overall vision of the president can be a crucial, even critical factor in how Congress reacts to a first-year legislative agenda. Now, the legislative contrast between Johnson's first-year record, granted he had 2 first years, we gave him a pass on that, and Trump's is, of course, striking. And it reflects a lot about Trump's limitations, and also those of his administration. Specifically, an inability to develop a coherent policy framework designed to achieve a set of broader goals, and then to guide, and when necessary, push towards those ends. Start with Trump's personal lack of policy knowledge, something Mike touched on. Goes beyond that, even interest in the nuances of policy. This deficit made this overarching goal of developing an agenda and a vision difficult. The president then compounded this problem by failing to surround himself with people who could make up for his own deficits. Self-knowledge matters a lot in any administrator, and nowhere less than in staffing the executive office of the president. This had 3 results, I think. One was the decision to open the administration's agenda with the ill-advised travel ban, which inflamed the opposition and immediately became tied up in the courts. The second result was that Trump deferred to Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan on legislative priorities. Out of this deference came the decision to pursue Obamacare repeal rather than to focus on infrastructure. I see this as a critical first-year mistake because it shifted the administration's focus permanently away from a serious effort to meet the substantive needs of its core voters and to address that underlying crisis of our politics that I talked about a few moments ago. Infrastructure is the key. It would have been popular. It would have made Trump seem like the strong, vigorous, can-do president that he claimed on the campaign trail that he would be. It would have shown that he was following through on his promise to help those who had been left behind by conventional politics. Not least, it would have divided the Democrats. Of that, I'm pretty well convinced. But Trump was unwilling or unable to challenge Ryan and McConnell on the agenda, and this pulled him into a situation where he was pursuing their priorities rather than his own vision or best interests. Once the repeal push was launched, we saw the third consequence of Trump's lack of a coherent agenda and vision. Even within the framework of health care repeal, Trump could only follow. Lacking even basic comprehension of the policy issues, who knew health care policy could be so complicated, remember? Lacking that basic comprehension, he could not save the Republicans from a situation in which they had not developed a viable replacement for the Affordable Care Act and in which they had badly misread the politics of the issue. Here's the thing. I've long argued that the Affordable Care Act is a fundamentally conservative solution to the dilemmas of our healthcare system. We can argue the details, but at its core, the ACA is a structure that increases coverage by bringing more customers to private insurers, that is, private companies, private businesses, and by expanding a 50-year-old legacy federal program, Medicaid, that is run through the states. These used to be conservative principles once upon a time in the Bush administration. A stronger and more sophisticated version of President Trump might have recognized the ACA for what it is and pursued a more limited version of repeal. Replace the individual mandate with a strong form of continuous coverage requirement. Offer moderate adjustments to ACA subsidy frameworks and regulations. Grant more discretion to the states, particularly over cost control and Medicaid implementation, a point that was explained brilliantly, by the way, in First Year Essay by Ray Shapak of the Batten School and also Miller Center affiliate. And at that point, unleash Trump. Send him out to convince his voters, his base, that he was repealing the Affordable Care Act. Let him do what he does well. Sell it rhetorically, declare victory, and move on to the next item on the agenda. Infrastructure and a more moderate form of ACA reform rather than repeal would have done much more to address real problems and also the alienation that I think drew voters to Trump. It would also have begun to build a true governing coalition that might have redefined our political moment and even had staying power. Now, I'm aware of a possible contradiction here. I'm arguing that Trump has not acted in any substantive manner to address the core problem of alienation. The politics was not working for his voters. But of course, those voters, his base, remain mostly supportive. But this is not actually a contradiction when we look at the full record. It is the tragic aspect of this missed opportunity of the first year. Trump has offered his base something, a form of identity projection in that they believe he represents them, and a politics of grievance against elites, against minorities, against immigrants, against protesters, against Hillary Clinton, James Comey, Robert Mueller, and now Andrew McCabe, against all that they do not like. We saw this most blatantly in his shameful remarks after the events here in Charlottesville on August 11th and 12th. We saw it reconfirmed in his comments 2 weeks ago about Haiti and Africa and where immigrants should come from. This is the tragedy. The choice to act as a president of a faction, to lead in anger, but not to address the real and substantive issues that led to his election. Trump has governed as he ran, deploying a leadership style that fed off of and encouraged division among the public. The result is a base that remains mostly loyal and angry, but also a determined, motivated, and I think very likely permanent opposition that simply can't be won over. And perhaps most notably, the political mobilization of women, which I think may be the biggest outcome in the end of the first year. We will see in November on that point. In this strategic choice, or perhaps by his very nature, Trump in his first year has further divided rather than healed the nation. Can he course correct? Perhaps in part. There are rumblings of a shift towards infrastructure in the early months of year two, and his recent steps on trade, although I find them highly problematic, and I think some of the same grounds that Mel identified, do suggest possibly a refocusing on economic issues. But the chance for Trump to be a transformative president, to change the nature of our politics, likely depended on the first year, as Lyndon Johnson said. And it is now, like that first year, almost certainly gone. Thank you.
So finally, we'll turn to Mary Kate Carey, and I just have to remark on her way up there, I have to give the shameless plug here for her new podcast, By POTUS. I listened to the first episode this morning, and it's fantastic, and it's now available on iTunes, so check it out.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'd like to second what Guillen said earlier, which is I arrived at the Miller Center as a senior fellow just as the first year project was launching, and it has been an absolute joy. And I want to thank Bill for including me in all this, and it's really been a fascinating experience. So I thought what I would do is I would start with my essay that I wrote in August of 2016 about the changing media landscape in political news and how the next White House could capitalize on that, and then talk about how that's unfolded over the course of the first year. So what I found in August of 2016 was that much of our news content in politics now comes to us through news feeds that are referred to us by friends, by our social streams, filtered preferences, algorithms, browsers, and often just personal relationships. And that is very different than how news was coming to us even 5 years ago. So my recommendation, amongst many, if you want to read it now, it's sort of a somewhat naive but optimistic set of recommendations looking back on it now. For example, one of my recommendations was that the next White House should prioritize influencing traditional news outlets in its first year. Margaret Brennan, who is a great graduate of the University of Virginia and is now CBS's White House correspondent, said that we should emphasize traditional news outlets because that would emphasize the need for nuanced analytical coverage of policies and initiatives, because YouTube and Snapchat, she did not say Twitter, but she might as well have, could be good at generating interest but not deep analysis, and that you need traditional media for deep analysis. And I would say that has certainly been true this year. So I had recommended that the smart move would be for the White House to increase, not decrease, the number of presidential press conferences. As you might recall, the Obama administration towards its end was having fewer and fewer press conferences. And I thought that was a strategic mistake for this reason of cultivating traditional news outlets. One of the first things the Trump White House press team did was expand the number of seats in the White House press office and include Skype seats for local media to be able to participate on a rotating basis at White House press conferences, which was very smart because more and more Americans turn to their local media as a more trusted news source for their political news. I also thought that administration officials, whoever won the election, needed to provide content that matches all these new digital media platforms. So, for example, videos that would go onto YouTube, long-form writing could go onto LinkedIn. More and more people go to LinkedIn now to read articles and essays by people whose name is right next to their work, and so you can immediately check their credentials and see if there's something you'd like to be interested in is trustworthy, as opposed to just going onto LinkedIn to find a job. There was a lot of people posting behind-the-scenes photos, for example, on Instagram, and live streaming things on Facebook Live. And all of those things, you have to match your content to that particular medium. You wouldn't say do a long-form essay that you're reading out loud as a YouTube video 45 minutes long. No one's going to watch that. So you have to match the medium to the message. And then the last thing I recommended was that spontaneity and unscripted moments, anything other than administration talking points delivered on a teleprompter, are wildly popular. So now they are even more wildly popular. That was back, a year and a half ago. Trust in government right now is, and was then, extremely low. And so I think that the best thing a White House can do is try to reach as many Americans as possible who are not necessarily visitors to whitehouse.gov and never will be. Mm-hmm. And so how do you find those people who are not signing up onto the White House website to get your message? How do you get your supporters to share your message to people whose minds might be changed? In many ways, White House communication strategy is really old-fashioned public outreach and coalition building, but now it's in people's hands on their phones. As Gian said, White House strategy in communications is not traditional under this president by its very nature and by the nature of his personality, as Mike pointed out. And so that may not change in 2018. What I wanted to do today, though, that's new and different from that essay is I did some research into how have things changed just since the election in terms of political news and communications. And so let me just share quickly a couple of statistics in the speechwriting business. When someone has a statistic that's surprising, we call it a cocktail crasher because it makes you drop your drink when you hear it. So unfortunately, we don't have cocktails here. But as of August of 2017, 43% of Americans report getting their news online now. That is only 7 percentage points lower than the 50% who get their news on television. In 2016, it was a 19-point gap between those two news platforms, television and online, and that has now decreased to a 7-point gap. So what's happened is fewer and fewer people are watching television, more and more people are getting on their computers and their phones to get their news. Mobile devices are increasingly preferred. Nearly 2/3 of U.S. adults who get their news both on a mobile and on a computer are increasing up from 56%. So people get their phones on their news on laptops and telephones now. The mobile news use grew the most between people ages 50 and 64. Mm-hmm. Young people were already there, but now older people are turning to their phones for more news. 2/3 of Americans get at least some of their news on social media. Again, driven by substantial increases among older Americans. Twitter saw the largest growth in 2017, just since the election, up 15 percentage points, the number of Americans who are on Twitter now. Had the largest share of users of any social media platform who report getting their news from Twitter, 74%. of people on Twitter are getting their news from there. So big picture, in the United States, we have a record high in terms of the number of people who are getting their news from social media. Whether people are trusting that news is a different question, but we are not number one in the world. We are number one in terms of the percentage of our older population that's getting their news off social media, and we are number two, for getting their news online. That's all courtesy of Pew. The other thing that struck me in this research was that, as I said earlier, we are not number one in the world for the percentage of people who get their news from social media. Ahead of us, in terms of advanced industrialized economies, South Korea, Canada, Australia, and Sweden all have higher percentages of their population getting their news from social media. South Korea, 20% more South Koreans than Americans are using social media several times a day. That is shocking to me. Amongst emerging and developing countries, the following countries, more people are getting their news off social media than the United States: Lebanon, Argentina, Vietnam, Turkey, Chile, and Brazil. So we are at 39% of our population, and as I said, South Korea is at the top, 57%. What this shows me is that there is a tremendous opportunity in the coming year for President Trump to use his global reach, because obviously there are more people in other countries who have access to President Trump's Twitter feed than Americans are using. So far, I think most people would say that his use of Twitter has been divisive and at times very polarizing. But if he were to change the tone of it, he could do tremendous good in terms of changing America's image abroad, and I think that's a tremendous opportunity for him in the coming year. As you look at what I would call the difference between teleprompter Trump and Twitter Trump, I'm a former speechwriter for George H.W. Bush, and the difference to me is quite jarring at times. I did a little research. There's something called TrumpTwitterArchive.com on the internet, and it has all of the tweets he's ever done. Since taking office, he has issued roughly 2,500 tweets over the last year. And on this Trump Twitter archive, you can type in words to see how many tweets had those words. The most that I could find was under fake news, 153 times. 98 in second place, Russia. And then there are a number of other words that are, various third, fourth, fifth place. Number 3 that is not substantive, but I just think is funny because it's become a catchphrase in our house, is sad exclamation point. And and he finds things sad exclamation point as varied as the Oscars, football playoffs, whether Bob Beckel should be on Fox News, global warming, and the Russian investigation. So if you want to sort of see the lighter side of Trump's Twitter feed, you can Google sad exclamation point. The flip side, though, is this is affecting his approval ratings. And just 26% of 1,500 Americans polled by The Economist said that Trump's use of Twitter was appropriate. So the majority think it's not appropriate. By the end of his first year in office, The Hill reported that he has spent about 40 hours on Twitter if you took the time for those 2,500 tweets. A staggering 59% of those polled said they disapproved of the president's near daily tweets to his 45 million followers. I do think he's not going to get off Twitter. I think he realizes that this is a direct pipeline that he will not walk away from, and it's a bigger following on Twitter than it is the number of people who watch the nightly news anymore. General Kelly, his chief of staff, was asked last week about this, and last week it was how he has at times undermined his legislative strategy by going onto Twitter and contradicting whatever the White House strategy is. General Kelly responded, he often asks me, hey, I'm thinking of reinforcing whatever the message is with a tweet. What do you think? General Kelly would say, absolutely. Sometimes he doesn't ask me that. He doesn't have to ask me that. He is his own man in this regard, and he feels very, very strongly that he is able to reach the American people out in Peoria, in Montana, in central Wyoming, through his tweets, because he does not feel that he's getting a completely fair shake from the media. And I think most observers, at least on my side of the aisle, would say they can understand why he thinks he's not getting a fair shake. So my hope, as a speechwriter, is that his tweets will start to parallel his rhetoric in his speeches and his legislative agenda. Despite the best efforts of his speechwriting staff, who I think are doing a very good job, I think there's a tremendous opportunity in the coming year for him to try and build coalitions. And as Mike noted, there's an opportunity not just to solidify his base, but to expand it, to change people's minds, and to broaden the governing majority in this country. So I think this coming year, given these numbers, hold tremendous opportunity for him if he chooses to take it. So on that note, I guess we'll take questions. Right. Thank you.
We'll throw it out to audience Q&A, but before we do, I want to press Mary Kate on one piece of her first year essay, and I need to read this because I just found it so striking. When talking about the changes in technology and the fact that more and more Americans are taking news from not just the internet, but using their mobile devices increasingly, she notes, if it wants to win its first year, the next White House must master these trends from the start in order to build trust and support among voters. If not, the new administration risks being left behind by the increasingly media-savvy electorate. So I'm curious, Mary Kate, in an excerpt where you note that the White House must master trends that both build trust and support among voters, how do you position Trump here? Because in one regard, as you noted, he's mastered this, right? He's mastered the use of social media. He knows what to say. He knows who he's talking to. But on the other hand, what's the effect on public trust?
Yeah, I would have to say the whole fake news phenomenon is not surprising to me because the numbers have been there for a long time. Trump is not necessarily the cause of this. In some ways, he's the symptom of it. The eroding public trust in the media has started a long time ago before he ever came on the scene. The same Pew research that I was citing on social media use does touch on people's trust in traditional news sources. And the U.S., this is fascinating to me, the U.S. is one of the few countries now where the governing party supporters are less satisfied with the news media than are non-supporters. So in this country, that would mean Republicans, only 21% of Republicans feel that the news media covers politics fairly. 55% of Democrats believe that the media covers issues fairly. That is the largest partisan gap, 34 percentage point difference in the world. There's only two other countries where the governing party mistrusts more than the non-governing party. So the second country that does that is Israel, which is understandable to me. Australia is the third, and those are the only three. The striking number of news sources that are trusted, local media is the highest. National news coverage second, friends and family third. Social media, those are all in the 70s and 80s, percentage of people who trust them. Social media, only 5% of those polled trust the information from social media. Last year it was 4%. So they leaped from 4 to 5% in 1 year. So that is shockingly low. And I think that explains why he thinks it's okay to continually pound the fake news, naming reporters by name, naming networks by name. I thought the fake news awards was ill-advised. I'm glad it came from the Republican Party instead of from the White House. But I did not think that was helping things for either of them to be doing it, but certainly for the president in the middle of the government shutdown to be worrying about that, I thought was misplaced. There you go.
So in the interest of time, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So Alfred has a mic in his hand, and if you have a question for the panel, please raise your hand. And let's take, we'll take 2 questions at a time, and wait, please, for Alfred to come with the mic. So we'll start up here.
This is really a question for Ms. McKee. I totally agree that Trump's failure to deliver on his promise of doing something about infrastructure is deplorable, and for all of us, not just Trump's base. I think, frankly, deferred maintenance of bridges and roads is a ticking time bomb. We're going to have another bridge collapse one of these days. But in terms of the base, just the other night I heard a union boss on television, he might have been from Illinois, who began by talking about the promise on Carrier that there was this very, ostentatious trumpeting of Trump's success in persuading Carrier to stay and not to, fire all these people. But he said since then, of course, that particular company has gone and, fired or put something like 500 people out of work. What was interesting to me in light of your comment is that he didn't talk about Trump's failure to come through on infrastructure. He talked about Trump's failure to keep American companies at home and keep them from going abroad. So I wonder, is that comment, do you think, an outlier, or does it sort of represent the feelings of, because he was specifically being asked whether the Trump voters were disappointed by his performance in that respect?
I don't think it probably is an outlier. I think that I wrote a little bit about the Carrier episode when it happened, I guess a year and a half ago, well, not a year and a half ago, late 2016. And my sense then and now is that it was an effective short-term strategy in the sense of, oh, wow, he actually jawboned this company into keeping these jobs. He's really delivering for us. But that's just not something that can be sustained for one company, let alone across the economy. And the other aspect is, particularly when we talk about manufacturing jobs, there are forces here that are just bigger than any president. And to put that much focus on your capacity to retain a particular sector of employment that faces huge headwinds is a very risky move. And the upside, I guess, is that he can claim every good jobs decision that happens. But in terms of that specific, fairly low to medium skilled manufacturing, it's going to be really hard to sustain that in the United States, regardless of who the president is. And he's in a position where I think for people like union members, there's an expectation that he would deliver on that, at least to a degree, and that will hurt him, has hurt him.
Right up front.
You say that Trump has mastered social media. The only thing I've seen him do a lot of is tweets. That was intentional, I'm sorry. But I don't see him doing much in any of the other social media, certainly not Facebook or, well, I don't know what all the others are, but I know I haven't seen him on any others. So could you speak to that?
That's a great question. Let's take another question before we...
Sorry, I jumped in.
That's okay. Let's go to Barbara, and then we'll go to Bill.
Thanks to all of you for your amazing comments today. They say, the old adage is, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. So presidents, unless they have these oddities where they come in and carry out an ex-president's term, usually don't get a second chance to have a first year. So my question is this. We know we have the State of the Union address coming up very soon. To our four presenters today, if this president called you into the Oval Office, and Mary Kate would have had an experience like this, but this president calls you into the Oval Office and says, asks you a normative question, what should I say to the American people? What one thing would you tell me to say to the American people in this upcoming State of the Union? What would you tell him?
Okay, well,
Twitter?
Yeah, why don't we start with the Twitter question? I completely agree with you that it's been overwhelmingly on Twitter that he's been active in social media. And again, a missed opportunity to use these other platforms to reach the people who would never go onto whitehouse.gov. And that, to me, I understand him wanting to do things differently than Obama. and rolling back some of the Obama agenda, but there were tactics that Obama used that I think Trump would be wise to follow up on. For example, on the White House website, the Obama administration had a videographer that followed the president everywhere and had behind-the-scenes videos and photos and things that they would post on this White House blog. And there were all kinds of people who would write on the White House blog who were various surrogates for different policies, or you'd have somebody from the Labor Department writing about unemployment or whatever, and I think that gave reporters a lot of places to go. It gave people things to share with their friends they could send to people who were interested in those things, and that seems to have stopped. I went on the White House website the other day. I couldn't find. I think the White House blog has stopped, and I wanted for this presentation to talk about the speeches that the president had given. To talk about the difference between the number of speeches he's given and the number of tweets he's issued, for example. And on the White House website, speeches are no longer separate as a thing that you can click on and scroll through. It's simply, it says like statements and papers or something like that. You click on it, speeches are mixed in. It's 186 pages long. And you have to go page by page looking for anything that's listed as a speech. I thought, there's got to be a faster way. I shoot my friend an email on the White House speechwriting staff, and I say, hey, can you tell me how many speeches the president gave in his first year? And she immediately wrote back and said, sorry, we don't have that. and I thought, how can that nobody be taking count of that? So they're doing things very differently from the Obama administration, and I certainly disagreed with many of the Obama policies, but I also think there were some tactics that they used that I'm surprised got stopped, and I think there's an opportunity to bring those back and try and reach some of the people outside of his base and start, as I said, changing minds and broadening the coalition.
Mike, what would you say about the State of the Union?
Well, as far as Trump relying on Twitter, I think two advantages that he derives from that, as opposed to doing Facebook and doing White House Gov and all the other things that one could do. And that is, first of all, you know where to look to find out what Donald Trump thinks. You don't have to go from one site to another. Twitter is the way he's going to express his thoughts. And the short, punchy 140 character, 280 character, whatever it is, it's short. And that seems to be a medium in which he's very comfortable, the quick punch or counter punch. So I don't blame him for doing what he's most comfortable doing and making it simple for people to find out where he is. As far as the State of the Union, a great question, Barbara Perry. Last year he gave a State of the Union, which most people thought was like a regular State of the Union address that a regular president would give, and people were commending him for that. And then in coming days, as if, he just got bored with being praised for that sort of quality, it was bang, 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 tweet about this, tweet about that, tweet about the other thing. So I think the advice I would give is whatever, first of all, know what your agenda is for the coming year, right? This is an annual speech. It's meant to kind of set the agenda for Congress and the rest of the government for an extended period of time. So know what you want to accomplish during the coming year. And then don't just give the speech, but give the speech as part of a coordinated strategy of articulating the message and then reinforcing the message. But I just don't that takes a kind of reining in of one's own tendencies to do what Donald Trump apparently does every day, and that is get up in the morning, turn on cable news talk, react to it, and the reaction goes straight from here to his right index finger, to his phone, to us. And because it's reactive, because it's what he sees or hears on Fox and Friends or Morning Joe or whatever, it's not part of a coordinated effort to not only articulate a message, but to reinforce that message in subsequent days. Something else, the praise that Donald Trump gave for his State of the Union address was kind of the praise you give for like your 8-year-old grandson who draws a picture and you think, oh, that's so beautiful. When Donald Trump gives a speech from a teleprompter, it's so obvious. He's just reading from a teleprompter, right? This is not something he's comfortable doing. And so in addition to Twitter, I think his his main form of communication with the American people is to have these campaign-style rallies in states that he carried in the election. And I don't even know if he has a text, but if he has a text, it's just there to, I don't know why it's there, because it's stream of consciousness. And he feeds off the support of his crowd, as in Twitter. Twitter is not his effort to reach out to the people who don't support him, nor are his speeches. His communications are to solidify the base that he already has. And in that sense, I think, he started out with 46% on Election Day. He had no honeymoon period, which was in part his fault, but also in part the Democrats' fault. And then it sort of got down below 40, and since then it's been pretty flat. So people chose up sides really early in the Trump presidency. They chose up sides whether they were for him or against him, and what he's done so far, at least, again, in the absence of crisis, in the absence of a recession, who knows what will happen when those kinds of events occur, which they're bound to, but consolidating that 35 to 39% is something he's been able to do. And that's enough. That is enough to keep the Republicans in Congress scared enough that they don't do what they would like to do, frankly, and that is defy him and get Mike Pence in there. But they're afraid to do that because they know that the voters who will pass judgment on them in a primary election are 35% of the whole country, but they are 70% of the people who vote in a Republican primary. So as long as he can keep that base solidified, which he's doing through Twitter and doing through these stream of consciousness rally-style speeches, he's probably okay for the coming year. But boy, these midterm elections in November, I think may be the most consequential in history. If he loses that Republican Congress, if he loses the Republican Senate, when there are 26 Democratic seats on the ballot and 8 Republican seats, and still loses, which is conceivable, you go state by state, that could happen. I suspect that Republicans in Congress will smell blood in the water and head for the exits, but that's getting way ahead of we'll come back next year, right? Trump's second year.
Mel, do you have anything to add to Barbara's question?
Yeah, I think if he called me, I'd say something like, Mr. President, I know you love the attention of the American people, and I know a quick way for you to garner support among 60% of the American population. Tell them you're going to step down immediately. Seriously, though, if he really did call me, let's say he really did call me, I would say, because I know, Stefanie, you think it's likely that he will. Otherwise, you wouldn't have asked this, or Barbara, you wouldn't have asked this profound question if you didn't think it was something that was likely to happen. I would say you should say to the American people that I know my first year has been deeply divisive, and I know that America's prestige has been reduced around the world. I think those things are very unfortunate. And I'm going to dedicate this new year to redressing these trends, and this is what I'm going to do, A, B, C, D, and E. That's what I would tell him to do. He'd hang up. I mean, when he doesn't like what he's hearing, he sort of ends it immediately. So.
Now, Mel, if you can get that into a tweet, he might see it.
There you go. So at our panel last week, we asked Mark Short, who's President Trump's legislative director, if he had any hints for us on what the president might say in the State of the Union content-wise. And he said, yes, it'll be infrastructure and immigration would be big parts of the speech. So as far as my personal advice goes, though, I agree with you, Mike. I think he's uncomfortable on a teleprompter. In general, his speeches are not the problem. He has really not gotten in trouble for anything that's been in his speeches unless he ad-libs. The UN, for example, he had Rocket Man that he ad-libbed into the speech. The speechwriters are giving him material that is very good and very standard Republican issue rhetoric. But you can tell from his delivery that he's not crazy about being on a teleprompter. And so to those ends, I would suggest that the speech be as short as possible. His speech last year was 1 hour on the dot. That was shorter than the trend over the last few presidents has been longer and longer State of the Union addresses. And yet, as we saw in this research, fewer and fewer people are watching television. And so I think in order to meet the audience where it is, I would keep it shorter with a shorter attention span of the people who are watching. Second, I would say most speechwriters, especially for State of the Union addresses, the fun part of the speech is writing absolutely shameless applause lines and trying to see how many times you can get people in the room to stand up and give a standing ovation. The partisan side of doing that is to try and get one side to stand up and get the other side to sit on their hands. But if you were being public-spirited and a unifier, you would want as many times as possible where both sides stood up. And so I would say in these polarized times, we would want as many applause lines as possible where both sides could stand up and agree on something. And then the third part is the fun part also of the State of the Union for me is I believe great speeches are made of great stories. And the only way to get some stories into the State of the Union are those people who sit up with the First Lady in the gallery. And some presidents in the past have used those as an opportunity to score political points and have people in those seats that illustrate their partisan agenda. The better ones, I think, if you're as old as I am and remember Lenny Skutnik diving into the Potomac River, he was the first one that President Reagan ever did to start this tradition. And Lenny Skutnik was a civilian who was sort of a first responder and saved lives diving into the cold Potomac River and pulling people out. And I think we've had a tremendous number of natural disasters this year, things like that where everyday Americans have done heroic things. And those are the kind of people I would put in the gallery this year so that everybody in the room can salute them and stand up together. And I think it's an opportunity to be unifying and draw on what's great about our country.
Can I say one thing about, when I was a kid, if the president gave a speech on television, well, there was nothing else on, right? The three networks, they're all showing the president. Over time, think about the coming of cable. So you didn't have to watch a broadcast network with the president. You could watch ESPN or whatever. And then along comes, remember, video cassette players? You could put in a movie or so, and since then it's just, so the audience that the president's been able to command just by giving that kind of speech, or any kind of speech, has gone down, which to me is fascinating about Donald Trump, because getting our attention has not been his problem, right? Cable news essentially went all Trump all the time during the campaign, not because of any sort of political agenda, but because they saw their ratings going up and therefore their advertising revenues going up, and it hasn't stopped. So political science is, President Trump, give a serious speech and then reinforce your points. That's the kind of thing we don't watch, frankly. What we'll watch is when the day after the speech, we sort of endure the fact that the president gives a long policy speech, and then what basketball player will he attack through Twitter or something like that. Then we've got to we're back on his wavelength. So this is a guy who is 71 years old. I'm 68, so I kind of know what that's like. He's been successful, certainly in his own mind, but I think by most measures, he's been successful at everything he's ever done in the business world, the entertainment world, and then lo and behold, he runs for president. First entry-level job for him. This is not a guy who's going to change his ways, no matter how good our advice is. He's just not. So I think we got to accept that the likelihood that he's going to grow, the office will make the man, or he will learn on the job or something like that. This is the guy we elected, and he hasn't changed one bit.
Ian, you have the last word.
I'll keep it brief. I don't think an election has ever been won or lost in a State of the Union address, and I don't think this one will either. Yeah. I guess I would probably say, similar to Mel, that he should think through his strategy really over the next 3 years. Is he trying to motivate that and sustain that base, or is he trying to reach out a little more to broaden it. And the speech should reflect that choice.
Thank you all. I think Bill has one thing to add, but I want to note too, please join us in the anteroom outside. Mike, Jeff, and I will be signing books, so feel free to join us.
Well, I want to close by just giving a lot of thanks to a lot of people that were involved in this. In addition to all of the people here, I think pretty much every scholar at the Miller Center contributed in some way, as did pretty much everybody on our communications team, our development team, our administrative team. This has been truly an all Miller Center project, and it's been terrific to see the whole team working together. And that extends to our governing council. We created also a first-year advisory council for the project that Mary Kay was part of. It was a bipartisan team of former administration officials from both Democratic and Republican administrations. It was a little like Noah's Ark. Every time we found one, we had to find another to go with them, to partner and pair with them. Barbara Perry, as the head of presidential studies, really helped coordinate this. And again, Jeff Chidester, who's back in the back, and Stefanie really played air traffic control. And then the last programming note is people have been asking, what comes after first year? And it's not second year. What we're going to be launching here in 2 weeks or a week and a half on February 5th is our new research undertaking, which will take us forward for the next 3 years or so. And we're calling it Presidency at the Crossroads, and it will look back across presidential history at great moments, going back to the founding era, all across Jacksonian and the Civil War era, and in the 20th century, periods like the Progressives and World War I, the Great Depression and World War II, in the 60s, how civil rights in Vietnam, and in the current moment where big domestic challenges couple up with big international challenges that face the president, and how different presidents have reimagined the office for better or worse, how they've taken the path that they're on and then considered turning right, turning left, or just continuing to go straight, or maybe sometimes making a U-turn. And so we're calling it Presidency at the Crossroads, and we'll be kicking that off on February 5th. Barbara Perry and I are delighted to host Jim Lehrer, who is on our governing council, and we'll walk with him since he was there when George Washington was president. Actually, Jim's service in studying and covering the presidency actually goes back to November 22nd, 1963, when he was a street reporter in Dallas and was there at Love Field when President Kennedy's plane landed. And that began a career where he's covered every president since. And we're delighted to have Jim walk through us some of the big decisions he's seen both in his lifetime but also back across presidential history. So we hope you'll join us on the late afternoon of February 5th. And with that, I want to thank the panel and thank all of you, and we'll see you in the back room and signing books.